Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I am honored and excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor David Greenberg and Professor David Blight. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to add a note of context for tonight's event. During FAN's 2016-2017 season, we had the deep honor of hosting Congressman John Lewis and his co-author Andrew Iden for two separate visits, once in the fall and again in the spring, for a total of 7 events. The occasion was the publication of the third book in the March Trilogy series. Those days and nights with Congressman Lewis and Andrew were simply astounding, impacting thousands of people, including hundreds of students from across the Chicago area. We will never forget his grace, determination, kindness, and uplifting messages. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos, including videos from John Lewis's visits here of past events. So be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. David Greenberg is a professor of history and of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University and a frequent commentator on historical and political affairs. He is the author or editor of several books on American history and politics, including Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, and Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency. Formerly acting editor of the New York Republic and then a columnist for Slate, Professor Greenberg now writes regularly for Politico, Liberties, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. His work has also been featured in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous academic journals. In support of John Lewis, A Life, Professor Greenberg won awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Cullman Center of the New York Public Library, and the Leon Levy Center for Biography. Joining him, and we are delighted to welcome back Professor David Blight. We previously hosted Professor Blight in January of 2019 on a frigid night with a 27-degree below zero wind chill. We hosted him in person in support of his extraordinary book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. Professor Blight is the Sterling Professor of History and African American Studies and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. In his capacity as director of the Gilder Lehrman Center, he organizes conferences, working groups, lectures, the administering of the annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize, and many public outreach programs regarding the history of slavery and its abolition. Professor Blight works in many capacities in the world of public history, including on boards of museums and historical societies, and as a member of a small team of advisors to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum team of curators. His numerous achievements, accolades, and awards fill many paragraphs, and it pains me not to mention them all. Let's welcome now Professor David Greenberg and Professor David Blight to FAN.
Thank you very much, Lonnie. Thank you to your staff. Thank you, David. David, this is an honor to do this with you. Congratulations. This is an extraordinary achievement. I have some notion of what it takes to write a big, full life of a world-class figure like John Lewis. Let's just cut right to the chase. How did you, after the other books you've done on the presidency, on Nixon and American politics, how did you land on John Lewis? How did you convince him, and maybe it wasn't difficult, to cooperate so deeply with you? And then did you have or develop while you were doing it a kind of method about biography that you can, cue us in on?
Well, thank you, David. And really, the honor is mine. I'm grateful to you for joining me tonight, and my thanks also to Lonnie and everyone at FAN, as well as to our audience tonight. I'm not flattering you when I say that your biography of Frederick Douglass, which I think you know, our audience may be interested to know, we shared an editor at Simon & Schuster, a
Right.
terrific editor named Bob Bender. And so for both of us, well, I wouldn't say I was directly trying to emulate your book. It kind of loomed as an example of how to do biography that is both scholarly and rigorous, but also speaks to a broad public and speaks to issues of the day, even. So being in that tradition and working with Bob at the same press was a nice treat for me. I came to John Lewis in the middle of, I guess, what we have to call the first Trump term, having done two books on presidents. And my previous book, which was newly published at the time, was called Republic of Spin, which was sort of a history of the White House spin machine, which I had finished the manuscript in late 2014, which meant Donald Trump was not in the book. And yet, when I
Right.
published in 2016, and I was doing events such as this, it was before we were all on Zoom, so they tended to be in bookstores and seminar rooms. I get a lot of questions about Trump, as I imagine I will tonight. And some people even said, well, look,
I'll save that for the end. Don't worry.
right, exactly. Your next book should be about Trump and spin. And I even sort of had the working title Beyond Spin, because
Ah,
I think Trump has sort of pushed it into new
good title.
terrain. Yeah, Beyond Spin. It was like Beyond Spin, alternative facts, truthful hyperbole. And I had a third phrase that I associated with him that I've now forgotten. But
Mm,
the fact of the matter was, each day as I turned on the TV or opened up the computer, I was having my fill of Donald Trump as it was. I did not wish to spend more time in his company, as it were. And I was looking, I wouldn't exactly call it escapism, but looking for something to take me away from just the chaos and noise and bombardments
yeah.
of the Trump presidency. And, you know, you and I, we both write op-eds, we weigh in on matters of public affairs, often with a historical perspective. And I continue to do some of that, but I wanted a book project that in a way would take me in a different direction.
Mm,
And it really just occurred to me one day that John Lewis did not have a proper biography, did not have a biography. He had his memoir, he had done those graphic memoirs, the March trilogy that Lonnie mentioned.
right.
And I thought, aha, here's a project for me. And I should add, you know, for you in your work, race and racism have been, I think it's fair to say, central themes of all your books. In
Mhm.
my first couple of books, they were not particularly prominent themes, and yet, as a historian of the United States, I recognize they are central themes in our shared history. And
Yeah.
so, writing about John Lewis would be a way to tackle at least one set of questions relating to our struggles to overcome
Yeah.
our legacy of racism in the American past. So then you asked about getting his cooperation. In some
Yeah.
ways, that was the hardest part. He's was a
Uh-huh.
very busy man.
Right.
And who did I know who might know him? I worked through different channels, friends, acquaintances, people from my days in Washington when I was a
Yeah.
political reporter. And finally, many months in, I get a call saying, Mr. Lewis will meet with you. This
Mhm.
was early 2019,
Yeah.
to give you a sense of his popularity at the time, because he'd been sort of ascending in the
Yeah.
popular imagination. He had just done with Andy Young the Super Bowl coin toss in Atlanta. He was the one. And the next week, the day after I was to see him, he was flying to Los Angeles to do the Oscars, where he was going to introduce Green Book, which wins the Best Picture. So you've got
Right.
Super Bowl, Oscars, and I'm wedged in there on a Friday afternoon.
Hi, I'm the scholar who called.
Yeah, exactly. And
Right.
to my surprise, first question about asking his cooperation, he just says, yes, I'd be glad to. So then I think, okay, what do I do with the rest of the meeting? Um,
Wow.
and at first, I did not think I was going to want to interview him right away, because
Mhm.
you know how it is. You want to get all your ducks in a row. There was
Yeah.
archival work to do. I still had a lot of the literature on the civil rights movement I wanted to get up to speed on. I
Yeah.
thought I'll interview him later in my process
Mhm.
once I really know what to ask him. Because
Mhm.
he said a lot. I didn't want to just ask him questions and get the familiar standard answers.
Mhm.
Well, the problem, of course, I mean, worse than a problem, was later that year in December, he learned he was dying of pancreatic cancer.
Right.
And within a short time after that, we had the pandemic. So I really
And
only
he only
had,
lived another year, right?
yes, exactly. I mean, another 6, 7 months
Yeah. Yeah.
after his
If that.
diagnosis.
Mhm.
So Michael Collins, his chief of staff, arranged for a few telephone interviews.
Mhm.
And those were good. They were helpful, but
Mhm.
really were nothing compared to what I found in a few just magnificent oral histories that others had done with him
Yeah. Yeah.
decades ago and were sort of buried in the archives. And again, because no one had written the biography, no one had
Right.
made full use of these oral histories.
Wow.
And then for the later years, through very extensive interviewing of friends, staff, family,
Mhm.
colleagues in Congress, uh, and so on. So it was a weird thing. I felt like I got to know John Lewis as well as I know, or better than I know people I actually know.
Yeah.
And yet I only spoken to him a handful of times. And
Sure.
it's one of the delights of doing biography, is you really feel you can understand a
Mhm.
human being who has occupied a different time and place from yourself.
Right. And your task is to get inside of that person's life, their head if you can, their heart if you can. I'm struck at how you got to interview so many of his staff, and he had staff who stayed for long, I mean, decades.
Yeah,
Michael Collins, I got to meet him too. I got to go 3 times, a tremendous privilege, 3 times on the famous civil rights pilgrimages, two
right,
to Alabama and one the year that they went to Charleston. It was after the Mother Emanuel massacre.
right.
And of course, his staff were always there, and they were amazing people, so
Yeah,
devoted to him. But also, I got a sense because there were lots of Congress people on those pilgrimages, just what awe the Congress people held John in. It was just remarkable. Even a few Republicans.
yes, yes. No,
I
that's
mean,
right.
well, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about. I mean, you had done biography before, but do you have a method about biography? Did it
Right.
evolve differently with John Lewis because of the kind of life he had, where he came from, where he landed? I mean, people, I get asked this a lot. What's your method of biography? And I sometimes say, well, I made it up as I went. But do you have a sense of here's how to do biography?
Uh, not, I didn't come in with any sort of fixed, well-defined method. And,
Yeah,
sometimes our colleagues in the social sciences seem sometimes surprised by the catch as catch can way that historians sometimes operate. And I guess
yeah,
I would suggest that there's method implicit in what we do, even if we're
sure.
not,
It's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
explicitly and overtly following it. I think there are sort of two particular challenges, or three, with someone like John Lewis. The first is that it hadn't been done before. And,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
when I wrote about Nixon, which was not really a biography, but had biographical dimension to the book,
Mhm.
I was following in well-trod tracks.
There've been a
And
few. Yeah.
yeah, and that can make it easier, but it
Yeah.
also in some way makes it harder to do something new and different and make a contribution, as we like
Yeah.
to say in academia. And
Right.
so what was especially fun with John Lewis is kind of feeling I was out there in the wild, with my, scythe kind of cutting through the tall grass myself and cutting the path
Yeah.
myself. Um,
Yeah.
the second aspect, I think, that was especially challenging, but for me has always been kind of where my interests have lain, is he's a figure of the recent past, where he
Hmm.
kind of straddles years when I was
Hmm.
not alive and precede my own memory, and also years I lived through and
Mhm.
know very well. Some people who it would have been great to talk to have long since passed, and maybe I
Right.
benefited from interviews they've given, oral histories in the archives, and
Mhm.
others who I could still get to and talk to. And having been a journalist for a few years full time early in my career and kind of kept it up as a bit of a side hustle throughout my academic career, it
Yeah.
was kind of fun to put both sets of skills to
Sure.
use.
Sure.
Um, there were times where, I found the historian's dictum to be true, trust the document.
Right.
People's memories said one thing, but then I went and found
Right.
archival proof that they were remembering it wrong.
Sure.
But then for the recent period where there was less paper available to me,
Mhm.
these interviews were just gold, and they especially
Exactly. Right.
helped me see John Lewis as a man in full, the personal side of
Yeah.
him,
Yeah.
just the fun, the way he loved, to rummage around in used bookstores or antique stores, the
Right.
way he loved to dance,
Right.
just the stories of his kind of silly side or quirks, all of that. You're not going to necessarily get from a paper record, and
No.
talking to people who experienced it with him. I'd say the final piece, which is a little bit related to that, when I first thought to do this book, I thought I'm really going to focus on the public man.
Yeah.
Uh, John Lewis is a public figure. He was a public figure from the time he was about 20 years old.
Right.
So I could write a life that way. But as I got into his story, I found I couldn't separate the public from the private, and in particular, the role of his wife Lillian,
Yeah.
who, little is had been written about her. She shied away from the press during her lifetime. But the more I dug into John Lewis's life, the more I saw how indispensable she was. I
Mhm.
won't say to the second half of his life. It was really the last 50 years of his life,
Right.
his whole political career after he leaves the civil rights movement. So, and if Lillian's a part of that story, well, she's his wife, and so
Mm.
his personal life and his relationships, they also become a part of the story. So I think I ended up writing a much more well-rounded kind of panoramic or multi-dimensional portrait of Lewis than I think I even had intended or expected to at the outset.
That's great because I had the same approach with Frederick Douglass. I mean, I set out that way, but one of the things I came to realize is if you're doing biography of a great public figure, they also live their private life every day.
Right.
You know, just like we do. We have a public and a private life, and they're not entirely separated. I mean, sometimes they seem that way, but that's not the way life gets lived. Well, let's take him back to the beginning. Let's take him through some of this trajectory. And I promise I want to get to the latter part of John's life because I know it's easy to get caught up in the origin story here. But he is this kid from Troy, Alabama, farmer, dire poverty, frankly. The boy from Troy, they called him. Um, he's from nowhere. Talk a bit about that. I mean, where John Lewis is from and how he somehow came up with this insatiable desire for education.
Yeah, it really is a remarkable story. I mean, he's the descendant of slaves. Most of his family had been really in the same parts of Alabama, the Black Belt, as it was called, not for the Black Americans, but for the soil that made it so fertile for cotton and other such crops. Um, and some had been Georgia, nearby, but basically in that part of the country. Um, Dirt poor. His parents did scrape together enough to own land and own a modest house, which maybe
Yeah.
to them was quite an accomplishment and a step forward, but it still required hard work. You could easily sink into debt and lose your land. The work on the farm was hard. And of course, this is Jim Crow Alabama. They're living under the boot of segregation, and not just segregation, but a whole social system where blacks are just on the bottom. They're not full citizens by a long shot. Now, I'm sure his parents hated that world, the poverty and the segregation and the racism just as much as he did. But
Hmm.
they and many of their generation
Right.
chose to, as he would later say, not get into trouble. They were grateful for their family, for the
Yeah.
work, for the church. I mean, they had other things to sustain them. Something in John Lewis, and it's there when he's a boy,
Yeah.
rebels against the system.
Yeah.
You see it when he understands that the white kids have buses, really nice buses to take them to school, and his buses always break down. Sometimes he gets home after dark as a result. He starts a petition to get better
Right.
buses, you know. Um, he's a reader, like as a young
Wanted
boy.
better libraries too. He wanted to find the better library.
Yeah, exactly. And he can't get a library card. This is
Right.
a
Right.
story he tells when he won the National Book Award for March.
Yeah.
He's denied a library card, and he again gets a petition, gets most of his playmates were his brothers and sisters and cousins who all lived
Sure.
nearby. They're unavailing. But this kind of activist streak, you see it there even
Yeah.
when he's a teenager, and he's reading the newspapers, the black papers.
Yeah.
He gets them from his school library. So he develops this consciousness about the emerging civil rights movement in the 1950s. He hears
Yeah.
Martin Luther King on the radio.
Radio. Yeah. That's a moving sort of moment. You
Yes, and
boy, and he's
I,
just convinced forever. I got to meet that man.
yes, and within just a few years he does, and King really becomes a friend, a mentor, a big brother figure, kind of his lodestar, and he adopts fully the whole philosophy of not just seeking integration into a full society, but of nonviolent, of Gandhian nonviolence
Yeah.
fused with kind of the Christian social gospel
Yeah.
teachings. And so anyway, it's remarkable that you see this in John Lewis as a boy. There's
Yeah.
just a desire to, build a better life, to tear down the system that he's born into. And he talks, even in his application to Bible college at age
Mm.
17 about wanting to make a better life for his people, for
Right.
Black Americans, and for all Americans. And of course, he goes on to do just that.
And that scared his parents, especially his mother, right? I mean, they were afraid the moment he went out and started doing this, he's just going to get killed. One thing that comes through in your book, many things do, but one of the things you do, I think quite poignantly, is to show what segregation really was. It was a system of humiliation. I mean, it was a system that sustained um, poverty. It sustained second class everything, but it was at the bottom of it. It was this kind of denial of dignity,
Yeah.
and that's he seemed to learn, and part of that may have been the Christian faith, but he seemed to learn how to transform that, convert that into a spirit to destroy it. And
Right. It's true. He doesn't allow it to make him resentful. I mean, as I
yeah,
think I would be, as I think most people would be.
yeah,
He
I,
he
not
channels
very
it.
patient.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of the things that's most remarkable about his character and his spirit, that this
Mm.
persistent ability to absorb the blows, whether it be the physical blows of people beating him up, state troopers or whoever it might be, or the psychological blows.
Yeah.
There's just this persistence in him that is quite uncommon, and I think really marks him from an early age.
It's almost unbelievable to a lot of people today if they really understand what he went through. I mean, everybody's heard the phrase "turn the other cheek," but nobody really does it, you know. All right, let's get him to Nashville because it's so transformative in his life. He goes to the American Baptist Theological Seminary, which is right on the edge of Nashville, and that's where, well, he helps create. I mean, he's influenced by other people, particularly James Lawson and others, but he helps create the civil rights movement in Nashville, which I'm not sure ever gets quite its due as a place, you know, where the civil rights movement boomed or blossomed or struggled. Uh, Talk about that stage of his life, if you will, because this is the 18, the 19, the 20-year-old kid who just becomes uh, an activist like few others and a
Right.
leader.
Right. And there's something special about Nashville as, a home for this activism. I asked
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
of his white colleagues in the movement, a student named Jim Zwerg. People, if they know his name, may remember, have seen a picture of Zwerg standing next to Lewis when after they've both been
Yeah.
bloodied almost
Yeah,
beyond
they're all blood on their
recognition.
faces, and yeah, yeah,
Right, on the Freedom Rides in 1961. And Zwerg, who's a religious man, said, he thought this was God's plan that all these amazing people ended up in Nashville in the same place.
yeah.
Look, there was an emerging civil rights movement in different parts of the South. People are
Right.
challenging segregation one way or another, um, trying to, desegregate a university or a high school or a
Mhm.
lunch counter. But the Nashville group, and in the spring of 1960, there's a whole series of lunch counter sit-ins, and
Right.
the activists from the different groups come together later that spring to form SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Right.
I think people don't always appreciate the Nashville group, even among all these courageous, admirable
Yeah,
young men and women, stood out. It
they
was
did.
the largest, it was the most steeped in the teachings both of
Right.
Gandhi and the Christian social gospel.
They were the
Uh,
most disciplined because of it, right?
right.
Yeah.
They had, months of reading, like as if in a college syllabus, classroom, they read Thoreau on civil disobedience. They read about episodes throughout history of nonviolent resistance. They read King, they read Gandhi, and then they did the
Reinhold
practice.
Niebuhr. Didn't James Lawson have them reading Reinhold Niebuhr?
Yeah,
I
they
mean,
were reading
amazing.
Niebuhr and
Yeah.
Rauschenbusch, and I
Yeah.
mean, pretty serious,
Theologian.
theology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting because John Lewis, most people, he never, struck people as an intellectual figure, but
Mm,
he was. I mean, after American Baptist, he's sticking around Nashville. He enrolls for a second degree at
yeah.
Fisk, the great black college in Nashville, where he majors in philosophy and religion, and he's reading Kant and Hegel. And
Yeah.
I interviewed people who were in seminars with him, and they said, "Oh yeah, he held his own in seminar. He knew what he was doing."
Yeah.
So this Nashville group is especially strong. They're well practiced. It's also black and white,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Fisk has a program where white students can spend a year or a semester there. And the type of white person who's interested in spending a semester in HBCU is probably the type who's going to get drawn to the movement as
Sure.
well. And
And Northern blacks too, right? Like Diane Nash. I mean,
right,
they're from
exactly.
the
I mean,
North.
yeah.
And for John, they were different people, you know.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Different set of experiences. I mean,
Yeah.
Diane also was Catholic, unlike,
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
who were Baptist or maybe Methodist.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting creative group that's there. I mean, also includes Marion Barry, later
Yeah.
of a less distinguished political career, perhaps, but
Right.
a fascinating group of young people. And, some are in it for a
Yeah.
year, some are in it for a few years, some like John Lewis, they're in it for a lifetime.
Right.
But I think the experience of having an integrated group,
Yeah.
which was not the case in every one of these college groups that goes in to form SNCC,
Right.
was important to John Lewis. It made him believe that the fight for, you know, racial equality was something that must be done,
Yeah.
in the words of We Shall Overcome, black and white together. And
Yeah.
that was an abiding belief he held on to his whole life. And again, not everybody believed that. And there comes a point in the 60s where some actively reject that.
Especially in SNCC.
Right.
Yeah. Well, now SNCC was, I mean, in the 60s, John was at the heart of SNCC, to say the least. Uh, but it was a bit of a crucible for him too, wasn't it? I mean, he's growing. He's still only 22, 23, 24 years old, at most, 25 finally.
Yeah.
By Selma, I guess he's 25. No, he's not
Right.
even
Right.
25.
Born in 1940. Yeah. His
Right,
birthday's
right.
coming up,
All right.
actually.
But this is a crucible for nonviolent, you know, resistance at a time when uh, you had to have that faith so deep in your bones or you couldn't hold on to it. And I don't know how one can explain what happens at Selma then in 65. Um, and how John could lead. I mean, he wasn't alone in this, but how he could lead against the horses and the police and everything. Um, but SNCC was a kind of crucible for all these young activists, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a crucible. It was a family.
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it was, they would tell me stories, people from SNCC I interviewed, just about, you
yeah.
know, they were all sleeping on each other's couches and taking long rides together, crammed into each other's cars. I mean, these are young people kind of doing
Yeah,
doing a lot of what young people do, but also doing some things that were quite extraordinary for people their age.
they're
And
changing the world
yeah, and
and risking their lives at
risking
changing
their
the
life.
world.
He
Yeah,
talked always, it was a phrase that comes out of the social gospel movement about the beloved community.
right. Big theme in your book. Go ahead.
Right. King used the term, and James Lawson, who was the divinity student at Vanderbilt, who was really kind of the guiding light,
Yeah,
along with Kelly Miller Smith, the minister at First Baptist in Nashville. They were the guiding lights of the Nashville movement. They
yeah,
talked about the beloved community, and it meant a kind of future, kingdom on earth, you might say, where problems would be resolved harmoniously without resort to violence, with kind of full equality, and to use a word you use, dignity
mm,
um, for
mm,
all.
mm.
And but Lewis also thought of this group around him in SNCC as a beloved community, in a
Yeah,
sense, that
yeah,
this was, the way they could work together, people from such different backgrounds and
right.
so on. Now, there were real ideological differences
Yeah,
within SNCC,
yeah,
and it's tribute to Lewis, but even more so to James Foreman, who was
right,
the executive director, who was maybe about a decade older than most of them. And
right,
he was the one, I mean, Lewis became chairman of SNCC in 1963, right
right,
before the March on Washington. So that's why he's speaking at that event, as the
right.
youngest speaker. But Foreman's the guy behind the scenes.
23 years old when he's there at the Lincoln
Just
Memorial.
staggering. Yeah,
It
yeah.
is. It really is.
And
Yeah,
Foreman, who isn't giving so many speeches, but he's got the kind of administrative genius that
yeah,
keeps it together. And so they're able to, I think, paper over isn't quite the right word, but they're able to sort of submerge the
mhm,
ideological differences. I mean, there are some, for like John Lewis, for whom nonviolence, turning the other cheek, not
mhm.
responding to your assailant with violence, but absorbing the blows, going to the
Yeah,
hospital if necessary, going to jail if necessary. That's a matter of deep conviction. There are
yeah,
others for whom it's just a tactic, that
yeah,
this
yeah,
it's going to be captured by the photographers or the television news. It's going to win us sympathy from
right.
whites around town or even around the country. And so it's smart politically, strategically, but
Yeah,
they don't particularly think they're going to convert these people
yeah,
to a philosophy of
yeah,
racial equality and inclusion.
No.
But Lewis believes in it. So these differences, they erupt from time to time, but SNCC manages to move forward. And it's really only after the great successes of the mid 1960s, the
Yeah.
passage of the Civil
Right.
Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act,
465. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
then you see these differences kind of erupt because there's less of that glue of the common goal
Right.
to hold them together.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a parting of, I mean, people who know any of the history of the civil rights movement know this. The rights stage and then the Black Power stage, and that all. Some of that was born within SNCC, but John never really changed. I mean, he changes like any human being, but he never really changes his ideological outlook, nor his approach to strategy, nor his faith and belief.
right. I mean, the core conviction is really remarkably consistent. And even people who were themselves, quite courageous in the face of violence, several people said this to me, and I found other examples in the literature, people saying, of all of them, John Lewis just had the most, it was almost like this serene equanimity overcame him
Yeah,
as he marched into possible violence. I
yeah.
found this press conference. It's probably the first national press conference he ever gave. It was
Mm,
during the Freedom Rides, the
okay.
1961
Right,
effort to integrate bus travel across the South.
right,
And they've been beaten up. The bus was firebombed. And,
right,
and Lewis and his group from Nashville are the ones who say, we got to keep these rides going. And
right.
he's doing a press conference with James Farmer, who leads CORE, another group behind the rides. King is there. And Lewis says, look, I don't want to die. I love life, but I'm prepared to die. He's 21 years old and such kind of precocious maturity. I mean, he's not doing this out of some youthful bravado, brashness. He's
No.
fully cognizant of what the stakes are, and he's made the decision that he's prepared to endure anything, including possibly giving his life for this. It's just a kind of stunning performance for a 21-year-old.
Well, and he all but did give his life over and over and
Right.
over. I forget the number of times he was beaten, the number of times he was jailed. Um, there was a loneliness in this kind of crusade, but he had. What I'm always overwhelmed by about John Lewis is just the depth of his faith.
Yeah.
It just is extraordinary. Well, I want to keep you going because there's a lot of life here,
Right.
and uh, I mean, the terrible year 1968 comes, of course, the assassinations, especially of King. It had a profound impact on John, right? And then he somehow is going to gather himself and end up in Atlanta.
It's
Uh,
really, yeah, it's 68. I mean, the years say 1966 to 68.
right,
66 is when he is deposed as chairman of SNCC. And I
right.
won't tell that whole story now, but there's a
Then
great
you'd have to
chapter
talk about Stokely Carmichael, but that's
of,
okay.
right, exactly. It's when SNCC pivots from
Right.
the philosophy of Lewis and Lawson and King
Yeah.
to that of Stokely Carmichael. And it's, what everyone thinks of the merits of these different approaches. Practically speaking, it was disastrous for SNCC. Among other things, their
Okay.
financial support dries up, support from the white community, from the middle class black community goes away.
Mhm.
Um, and Lewis is cast adrift, for the first time at age 26, this
Yeah.
movement that's been his whole life, his livelihood,
Yeah.
he's got to find a new path. So
Yeah.
in 1968, he thinks he finds it because he's very much against the Vietnam War, and he's drawn
Right.
to the presidential candidacy of Robert Kennedy,
Right.
the OG Robert Kennedy, the original. And he's sort of doing black liaison work to the black community. He's there with Bobby Kennedy on April 4th, 1968, in Indianapolis. This is the
Mhm.
night that in Memphis, Martin Luther King is killed.
Right.
And Bobby Kennedy gives this famous speech where he's extemporaneously quoting from Aeschylus.
Right.
And I have some really beautiful scenes of him and Lewis and his trying to understand the grief
Yeah.
and the pain that Lewis feels.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Lewis is there 2 months later to the day in Los Angeles in the
Yeah.
Ambassador Hotel when Kennedy himself is murdered.
Yeah.
And it sends John into just this downward spiral.
Yeah.
These were the two men on whom he was still pinning hopes for a beloved community.
Mhm.
And he really doesn't know where to turn. His doctor says you need to check yourself into the hospital.
Yeah.
Exhaustion, depression, not quite
Yeah.
sure why. Anyway,
Breakdown.
yeah, right.
Breakdown. Yeah,
Basically breakdown.
Yeah.
And this is the time where for the first time in his life, he's been seriously dating someone,
Yeah.
Lillian Miles.
Right.
And she's visiting him in the hospital, bringing him his newspaper and his mail. And very unromantically, he proposes to her from the hospital bed. And she accepts. That winter, they're married. Daddy King, Martin's father, performs the wedding, Martin Sr. And Lillian becomes sort of the engine
Yeah.
of this new path, which is going to be in politics. There's a
Right.
congressman from Georgia named Buddy Darden from the adjacent district. He white guy, kind of white moderate, but very close with the Lewises. And he said, you can't understand the whole second act of John Lewis's career unless you understand Lillian.
Right.
John was very self-effacing.
Mhm.
I mean, he
Yeah.
had conviction and he could be stubborn and rigid, but he was often content to let others be the one to go forward. He let, his friend Julian Bond was the first one to run for state legislature in Georgia. Lillian always gave John Lewis the confidence that he could do it. He could
Yeah.
run for office. He
Yeah.
could run for U.S. Congress. He could, in 1986, run against his friend Julian when
Yeah,
that's
his dear friend Julian, what they weren't that wasn't such a friendly campaign.
right,
But
exactly. And we can
I
talk about
love
that
the way
too, but
I love the way you've transitioned here through the marriage and now to a political life. I mean, city
right.
council. I mean, he starts at the bottom, politically,
Yeah,
and the story of post-civil rights, Black people actually getting elected to this, to that, to this, to that. And he always had that shyness about speaking. I mean, he
right.
could contemporaneously speak anywhere, but he had a little lisp or a little
Yeah, yeah,
impediment,
stammer.
that very rural accent, and he had to overcome all that. And everybody thought he was just kind of a hayseed, especially when he
Yeah,
had to face Julian Bond, who was the most suave dude in
yeah.
American politics. But into the 70s now and into the 80s, he becomes a political person, right?
That's exactly right. And he sees politics as sort of the next frontier
Yeah,
in the civil rights movement. I mean, our in our field in academia, it's become fashionable to talk about the long civil rights movement
right.
as a way of
Yeah,
reminding people it wasn't just, from Montgomery bus boycott through
no.
Memphis and King's murder that it had a longer prehistory and it continues after. But I think
We do the
as
same thing now with Reconstruction.
right, exactly. Where does it begin? Where does it end?
Right, right.
But I think with the civil rights movement, we've neglected the extent to which electoral politics really becomes an important arena for it.
Yeah,
And this is an insight of another one of Lewis's mentors. And I think in my book, I found there was much more of a relationship there than had been realized, which is Bayard Rustin. That
uh-huh.
Bayard Rustin,
Right.
at the same time that Black Power is kind of enchanting and tantalizing some in the movement, Rustin says, no, no, like he wants power for Black people too, but he says, let's do it through politics,
Yeah,
through coalition, the same coalition that brought us the March on Washington, that brought us the civil rights bills. And that's kind of where Lewis sees promise. So
right.
he goes into politics seeing it not as a departure from the activism, but as an extension of it. Now, there are some ways in which it is a departure. Politics has different rules, and you got to learn to compromise, and you can't just be self-righteous.
Got to get elected.
Right. But it takes him, in Atlanta politics, and I mean, there's a lot in the book.
Yeah.
A turn in the Carter administration in the late 70s, which is quite
Right.
interesting.
He gets an
Um,
appointment. Carter.
right, an appointed position, and um, goes back to Atlanta, serves on city council, and then, as we said, in 1986,
Right.
the congressional seat for Atlanta, the fifth district opens up again. The Congressman Weish Fowler, a white liberal moderate, decides to run for Senate,
Mhm.
and Julian Bond and John Lewis, who really are the best of friends, they
Yeah.
vacation together with their families, they celebrate their birthdays together. Both of them are determined to get in the race, and neither one will step aside. Lewis had run in 77.
Yeah.
At that time, Andy Young, who was the first black person elected from the district and first black congressman from the modern South, had gone into the Carter administration, creating a vacancy. Lewis finished a creditable second to Fowler. So he thought, okay, now it's my time again. Well, Julian remembered, no, you got to run the first time, now it's my turn. And they each had a different recollection. So everybody thinks the seat is going to go to Julian Bond. He's
Right.
glamorous, dashingly handsome.
Right.
Now we talk of Lewis as this cultural icon, but was Bond, who
Oh
was
yeah.
on SNL, in
Oh
the
yeah.
movies,
The
um,
narrator of Eyes on the Prize.
narrator of Rise and Prize, yeah, and had these beautiful Pierre Cardin suits,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
and Lewis was sort of this rumpled guy.
Yeah.
People remembered he did these heroic things in the movement, but he was a guy around town.
Yeah.
But he had two things going for him. One was he just worked harder.
Yeah.
And
He
so,
would go everywhere, right? He'd just go into stores. He was a
yeah,
street politician.
yeah, and really was good at the retail politics. And
Yeah.
the other thing was, it was kind of an open secret in certain Atlanta circles
Mm.
that Bond had a pretty serious cocaine problem. And
Yeah.
this was the summer of Just Say No, when voters ranked drugs as the number one concern. There are
Yeah.
famous people overdosing cocaine or crack. And in these debates that they have, it comes down to a two-man runoff.
Right.
Lewis is very reluctant, but his campaign manager is saying you got to use this issue.
Right.
And finally, Bond comes at him with some kind of piddling allegation that's kind of BS about having taken money from a lobbyist who was just a friend of Lewis's. And he says, Julian, I think we should both go take that drug test. And, we don't know what changes voters' minds.
Yeah.
But in the first round of the election, Bond, when it's a multi-candidate race, Bond had finished with 47% and Lewis with, I think, 35. On
Mhm.
the second election, Bond goes up to 48%, 1 point, and Lewis to 52. So it
Well,
comes down
and
to nine.
I sensed,
Yeah.
David, in that chapter, you really had some fun narrating that campaign. I mean, it's a classic kind of
Yeah.
post-civil rights political campaign between these two already kind of iconic figures. And it is a great story, and it shows you that real politics is real politics, no matter who's doing it.
Absolutely. And it shows John Lewis's ability to get comfortable with politics and
Yeah,
to
yeah,
understand sometimes you got to go negative. Sometimes, you can't just take the high road and,
well, it's
later in his
served him
career.
well later.
Yeah. I mean, look, he was to the last a well-respected and admired man, but
Yeah,
when it was
yeah,
necessary in the 90s to go after Newt Gingrich, hammer and tongs, his fellow
yeah.
Georgian, he
And
was
didn't
ready
Gingrich
to
do
do
it
that.
back to him? Wasn't Gingrich always trying to run people against him and get John Lewis out of the Congress? Wasn't that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they were sort of arch rivals, but Gingrich also kind of couldn't understand, why does John Lewis have it in for me?
Oh,
And for Lewis, this was politics. Here was
yeah,
the guy who had taken control of the Congress
yeah,
from the Democrats and was advocating, slashing Medicare and you know,
rolling it back. That's what he wanted
rolling
to
it all back, all these social provisions and social protections. And Lewis was, I'm not going to have any of that. A lot of people, a lot of Democrats, I mean, we have a similar moment now. We're sort of cowed. Has our time passed? Do we need to sort of cooperate with the new agenda?
do.
And Lewis was sort of out in front with the opposition.
Well, they're going to tell us we're running out of time. It's
Right.
amazing the time.
Always, yeah.
But now, but then John stays a long career in the Congress, uh, uh, through thick and thin, through various presidential administrations. He's very close to the Clintons, although he could be critical of Bill Clinton. He came to rather loathe George Bush W. I mean, he had real tangles with Bush. Um, but then John endures to the point where, at least within his own circles and a few Republicans call him the conscience of the Congress. I mean, that's and that's I want to hear you on that because it's so
Yeah.
similar to Douglas, although Douglas never held office. But John is the old radical outsider who becomes this political insider and really succeeded at it. That's a rare thing.
Yeah, he really does. And look, some people would say, well, he's not a legislator. That is, he didn't
Yeah,
take up a policy issue like drugs or education or housing and kind of own it the way, you
yeah.
know, some other congressman we could name. But in a way, and I spoke to Barney Frank, sort of the great
Oh,
liberal from
right.
Massachusetts, who said, I had a lot of colleagues who could do that.
Yeah,
I only one who could be this voice of moral authority.
yeah,
And Lewis came to know how to use it well. So,
yeah. Good
if
timing. Yeah,
somebody
good timing.
yeah, if somebody needed support for a bill, he knew attaching his name as a co-sponsor could really help bring on others on board, even Republicans. Sometimes when people would vote in Congress, they would sit out the first round. This is especially true in later years.
Right,
The newer members, let's see what Lewis does. And so if he
right.
voted for it, then that was kind of
And
a kosher
and on
entry.
something as important as the renewal of the Voting Rights Act.
Absolutely. And
Crucial.
you get
A
his
Republican.
support, a guy named Jim Sensenbrenner, who was a
Yeah, yeah,
fairly conservative Wisconsin Republican, but one who did want to renew it. But they had to cut a deal where it would be renewed without any amendments, either pruning it or extending it.
yeah.
And once Lewis supported that compromise, the whole Republican Party, I mean, there were some holdouts, and he gave them a tongue lashing on the floor of Congress when it was necessary.
Right.
Um,
But they could look good then.
they could look good. And you talked about the pilgrimages to Selma, and I'm excited to go myself for the first time in a few weeks.
Yeah.
And Lewis, when the Republicans would come, and some would come, he would make a point of making sure they were upfront with him, that he would show their family a good time. He understood they're making an effort in a way the Democrats weren't to come. It was
Yeah.
maybe going against some of their constituents or whatever, and he wanted to make sure it was worth their while. So for all his ability to be a partisan warrior, which he could be, he also could be the most bipartisan and cooperative of
Oh, yeah.
congressmen when the situation called for that too.
On one of the pilgrimages I was privileged to go on, he got Kevin McCarthy to come. And there
Yeah,
was Kevin McCarthy with his two daughters holding their hands, walking across the Pettus Bridge singing, "We shall overcome."
right.
You know,
Yeah,
this is just before McCarthy became speaker, but
right.
nevertheless, it was already, I think, minority leader or something. But
Yeah,
but Lewis could get these guys to show up.
right.
No one else could. Uh,
Right.
and I guess that's a place for us, for you to take it out. There just is no other moral, moral political leader in our recent history quite like him. I mean, and especially that's so worth saying right now when we yearn for a little bit of truth, at least, much less moral politics. I mean,
Yeah.
say a word about that because that's John's core legacy. I think.
Right. And I can say more in the after hours for those who are joining us there. But, in the later chapters, when I'm writing about the Trump presidency, 2017 to 2020, I have these stories of people both in Congress, but also just ordinary citizens, sort of just turning to John Lewis as a source of inspiration, of comfort, of hope.
Yeah.
And he was able to kind of provide that to help people believe that even in the darkest of times, we could persist and keep going. And again, I don't have time to tell them now, but there's some just beautiful stories of just ordinary citizens encountering him, wanting to touch him or hug him, almost in like a religious or holy way, and draw
He was a
sustenance
holy
from
man
that.
to some people. I saw that happen on those. People would see him. Oh, and they just run across the street.
Yeah.
Just, well, yeah. Uh, and he lives all the way to Black Lives Matter. He lives till that summer. Wow. It's a great book, David, and I encourage everybody out there, if you're not one of the lucky ones that gets it free, buy it. And it's a great read, too. Those of you who are lovers of history and of biography, this is a splendid read at the same time. It's a very important piece of history.
Well, thank you, David. I appreciate the kind words, and I do hope readers find their way to this book because I think it can say a lot to us, particularly at this moment.
Congratulations again.
Thank you, David.
Sure. Pleasure.
Like, thank you so much for
Well, Lonnie, back to you.
informed conversation with David Greenberg. We really appreciate, we just stand in awe of your scholarship and your work. You are welcome back to FAN anytime. Yes, I know it's a beautiful book. Many of you are going to be lucky recipients of that book, but honestly, I agree with Professor Blight. Buy an extra copy. You absolutely know at least one person, if not 10 people, who can use a copy of this book. It's a great read. It's a fast read. Yes, it's a big book, but it's a fast read. It's kind of a page turner, and especially for those fond of Congressman Lewis, and who's not really, let's be honest. It's a beautiful book, and we're really honored, Professor Greenberg, that you spent some time with us tonight. We're really glad to be able to hop onto your book tour and be part of this. For folks who are like, gosh, I want to spend more time talking to David Greenberg, and maybe we'll be lucky with a few minutes with Professor Blight as well. Maybe. You can come to
Okay, I'll stay for a while. Sure.
Hey, come stay with us. Yes. No pressure. We're going to be doing after hours. We're going to open it up at about 8:05 p.m. That's in about 6 minutes from now. How do you get to come? A donation of any dollar amount. You decide. Anything that's meaningful to you, make a donation to FAN. We've been popping the links in chat all night long. Make a donation. We'll send you the registration to after hours. After hours is going to go 55 minutes. You get to ask your questions, chime in, offer your observations. It's been such an incredible event. We have so many great stories about Congressman Lewis from when he was here. He made such an impact. What a great night. I feel, and I would say it's not often in the last several months I felt this way, but I'm feeling elevated. And I don't know, I feel good right now for what that's worth. And, I'll take it to the bank. So we're at 8 p.m. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hope to see many of you at after hours. And if not, come join us tomorrow night with Mary Frances O'Connor. What a brilliant neuroscientist talking about grief. Come join us. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see both Davids in about 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.